friend and colleague Ramon Sarro, who used to be with us here in Lisbon and left us. He's now in Oxford. But he will present Professor Murray last, and we will enjoy this keynote speech. So thank you very much once again to all, and I give the floor to Ramon.
Thank you, Clara. Hello, everybody. I was here in Lisbon almost by accident, not for the conference, when Clara and Christiana heard that I was here. And they very, very kindly invited me to be here now because they knew of my friendship and especially great admiration for Murray Last. So, who introduced me to anthropology about 30 years ago at UCL. So it is my very special pleasure to introduce Murray, not only to all of you, but actually to introduce him to my very dear city of Lisbon. Of course, Murray Last doesn't need much introduction, but I think it's worthwhile remembering that he is one of the fathers and most important authors in medical anthropology, especially in the UK. He is the only anthropologist I know who, when doing a viva for a PhD, an examination for a PhD, he appeared with a Nigerian gown. And this is because, in fact, he happens to be the first person to get a PhD from a Nigerian university. He got his PhD in 1964 at the University College Ibadan, after having studied at Cambridge and Yale, where he did very interesting things like Chinese history and other fascinating pieces of research. He just told me now, I didn't know, that in fact, as part of his MA training, he translated a book from Mandingo into English. But anyway, this is the kind of person that we are today going to be listening to. Murray specializes in the history of pre-Muslim northern Nigeria, the Hausa and full inhabited regions of northern Nigeria, especially in Kano, where he has been a professor of history for several years. He goes to Nigeria since the early 1960s every single year, and he knows more about Nigeria than anybody else I know. In fact, a few months ago, I could see some very respectful Nigerian authorities being very ashamed because they didn't know that Murray Last would be in the room where they were speaking at Oxford. And in Nigeria, he's done very interesting things. He's been a traditional student in Hausa history, and he was also living for 2 years in a farmstead among the Maguzawa, who are the non-Muslim Hausa. And out of that research, in fact, emerged a very interesting series of papers that we, in fact, are now trying to rediscover. Last year we did a workshop based on a single small paper that Margaret wrote back in 1980, which he never published, in which he was advancing a regional model, how to study the Muslim and the non-Muslim Hausa together, in a model that in fact resembles the kind of models that, say, James Scott is now putting forth in his Art of Not Being Governed, but Murray was doing it about 40 years earlier. He wrote, of course, a very famous book called The Sokoto Caliphate, which shows and testifies to his great ability as a historian of Hausa things. A book that was published in 1967, but has been very recently translated into Hausa in Nigeria. And most relevant, perhaps, for you guys tonight, he is the author of a very, very important, some seminal works on medical anthropology, like that famous article on the importance of not knowing, and the book he edited with Professor Chapunduka, The Professionalization of African Medicine. For us Africanists, I say us Africanists, you know, I know Murray more as an Africanist than as a medical anthropologist, which I am not. But certainly from us working on related topics in Africa, Murray has been a very authoritative author but also someone we have to be very grateful for. Not only for his work, for opening new models, proposing new systems of analyzing African societies, of analyzing Muslim and non-Muslim communities, of thinking and rethinking the Sharia problems in Nigeria. But also, and I think it's worth mentioning it, because Mario was for many, many, many years, secondly the years I was based at UCL, the single editor of the journal Africa, which is the most important journal in our field. And only to tell you how big the job is, I will tell you that now there are 3 editors in Africa. So Mario was, on top of training people like me into the mysteries of medical anthropology and anthropology of Africa, he was doing this fantastic work as an editor for the Journal of the International African Institute. So tonight, I cannot tell you what he's going to tell us, basically because he didn't tell me. But I can tell you that we are all going to be very illuminated by his unique insights, as I'm sure many of you have experienced in the past, and if not, I can assure you that it will be a very pleasant occasion.
I think I better stand up, in part because one gets close to being 6 foot above contradiction. But I will hope to have Ramon at the day of judgment, because he might do better on my behalf than if I were to stammer my way through the questions. By the way, in northern Nigeria, we know that the end of the world comes on a Friday, so you've got a day or two at least to be ready for it. But I should also just say that this room may be warm, but it's nothing like it was in Sokoto in November last year, when I had to speak in praise of the caliphate to a sea of urbans. The only advantage was that they almost certainly paid no attention to what I was saying, but in the midst, the lights went out. So, of course, I brought out my torch and continued reading what I was trying to say, but I don't think it made any difference to whether they heard what I was saying or not. It was slightly politically incorrect, so I was quite glad not to be heard. Anyway, let me start this by pointing out that it is, as ever, an honor to be invited to give a keynote and an address, and especially when it's an invitation to a dinosaur like me. For it is exactly 50 years since I switched from Nigerian history, to restart in the then new subject of medical anthropology. I was, of course, in northern Nigeria at the time, and the Biafran War had just begun, and I had close, passionately Biafran friends. Furthermore, a new university teaching hospital was being started then in northern Nigeria. And I knew full well that none of its staff actually knew what was going through the mind of their patients. So I turned to anthropology with the intention of creating a Hausa medical dictionary based upon what people, ordinary people, mainly women and children, actually said amongst themselves when one of them fell ill. From all this, I could make some sense of their ideas about anatomy, about physiology, and show how very different were the bodily systems they were living in compared to those described in school textbooks. I'm speaking back because the light is better. So I will bring this even further forward. So, in a sense, with this conference being on bodies in transition. I look forward to hearing accounts of how other bodies have been construed and how these constructions have changed over time or haven't. Last month when I was again back in the farmstead that I lived in, we were discussing how the body is made up of an outer system, liquid system, and an inner system, a solid one. And my friends there said, yes, that's still what we think, though they can put up drips and do injections, yet the underlying sense of how the body works is persisting, not just amongst that educated lot, but also with ordinary folk. Anyway, such an approach meant, of course, that I wasn't going to do interviews or focus groups or surveys, not even study healers, because everyone studies healers. The difficulty thing is just studying people who possibly may not like being studied, but healers sometimes quite like it. And I did so by, as Graham was saying, by living in a single, large, rather remote, non-English speaking farmstead for 2 whole years as a guest. I tried to make clear to any students I have that you go out to feel that as a guest. You have no right to ask questions, no right to get answers. You're a guest. And in some senses, I think it's important just to remind people that that is, in a sense, the ultimate role, that we are strangers being looked after. But it is to that same farmstead that I've been having, as Roman says, every year for the last 40, actually it's more like 46 years, 47 years. And most recently, I was spending part of the last month's June during Ramadan. Of course, being a pagan, I was given breakfast as well. But they weren't. As ever, I learned more by going back, and I learned more and more about how very worrying, even controversial, my initial presence there was. This is not a world where you see whites. I thought I would get away.
People are complaining in the back, they can't hear you well, so if we move the microphone. No, it's too high. Is that good? Try it now.
In the good old days. Oh, I thought I was getting away with it. I have to admit, in Nigeria, I occasionally had to give lectures to rooms of 600 people. And a student at the back who was reading his newspapers and had to develop skills of throwing chalk right to the back and hitting the newspapers. Once you've done that, you have the audience in your hands. Cricket has some advantages. Anyway, but my point was that how controversial my presence in the farmstead actually was. For some, I was not only just a risk to have in, but a kind of demon. In fact, they knew I was a witch, and I was in a battle royal with another witch. What was interesting was they reckoned that it would be me who would be dying or running off. Aha! But instead, the witch, my rival witch, went mad, and he has died. So I'm a victorious witch. Anyway, but as a demon, despite as a demon, I was given access to the minutiae of domestic life. I could see how housewives would whisper apologies. One wouldn't see their lips moving to any spirits that might be affected by their sweeping, which they did each day. Or when they filled their bowl with hot water, you would say, "Excuse me, please, madam." Even, and this I have only on report, when a woman gets into her bed, she would normally sweep the bed with her hand just to move the spirits off. You may think spirits don't matter, but how do you know? Anyway, but also, of course, when a baby girl was having what NGOs call FGM done to her, I happened to be there, not by intention, but I simply was. And what's interesting, almost no researchers actually see with their own eyes what exactly is being cut in FGM. Of the 3 PhD theses I've examined on FGM, not one of the students had actually ever seen it done. It's one of those things people write about, but don't know much about it, much like Boko Haram. But what in fact took place was the barber was nicking the hypertrophied hymeneal tags and not ever touching the clitoris, which on a very young baby you actually can't see usually. I have to admit, it was my late wife who pointed this out, what was actually happening. And in this instance, what they were trying to do was prevent the vulva from closing over time. So it's totally unlike what you read about in the Sudan or Ethiopia. And they also cut the uvula so as to prevent the throat from closing. In this world, it's about opening and not closing. My general point, of course, is that we do need actually, obviously, to witness what we are writing about and not just rely on what we are told. And medical anthropology, that's quite hard. It's not a simple thing, particularly with things like FGM. The last thing they want is some whitey peering and noting and photographing. I actually have a photograph of what happened with the hymeneal tags, but otherwise I think it's quite rare. But I'm also suggesting that we as anthropologists know remarkably little about the actual details of the religious lives of women and their kids, about the boundaries and the sites of the risk, and which wife is sometimes braver than others. One gets awfully tired of generalizations based presumably on gossip. But it is the religious lives that I would like to know much more in the domestic sphere. It's extremely difficult actually to see if this wife or that wife actually prays in her room. There's almost no evidence offered. People like to study the religious lives of women in churches and all the rest, but not in their rooms. But close friends have often revealed all sorts of things which not even their husbands knew about. So what I'm suggesting is there's a lot more outside, and conversion to Islam has made the variability amongst women even more. Some women that I have known almost since they were married are strict Salafis. Some are more Sufi. Some, despite their manhood, prefer old-style religion and practice it almost invisibly. One's got to get an eye or an ear for what's happening, because it's not public. And that applies to their daughters too. It's very odd to sort of see people gradually change from being very religious to less religious or whatever. And particularly in one case, an old friend whom I've known for 30 years, just before he died, he was a friend who had converted to Islam and had done the Hajj, been to Mecca, actually regretted explicitly that he had converted to Islam. To do that, he didn't do it to me, I mean, he did it to one of his children, but I think it was his senior wife who really pushed him into regretting it. I remember when he was beginning to think of converting 30 years ago, 35 years ago, I happened to be there, and his senior wife got possessed by a spirit who argued you mustn't convert to Islam. She outlived him. Not now, she died last year. But my point is, even the committed converts have worries, have second thoughts, and one can't just assume that a convert is a convert. So I'm arguing, of course, that much remains to be done in depth. And I have to admit, my argument for going back every year to the same farmstead, apart from the fact that they spoil and look after it, is because depth seems to be much more interesting and often quite new to me than going wide. I'm not a great fan, as you can imagine, of doing field work in every continent. Anyway, so I regret that how few postgraduates from abroad can now spend such long periods of time as I was allowed to do within the household, seeing and hearing what was going on, and of course of being immediately corrected when the point of something has been missed. The amount of errors I have made, and people say, after more than 40 years, you still don't know this? Well, like all of these things, the farmstead has indeed changed. When I first was there in 1970, we had 60 children. So it was quite a big farmhouse. Now, the total of children is nearly 500, all with these modern Islamic names, which leave me entirely unable to remember them. But at 350, 400, 450, I gave up some years ago trying to know who in fact was who. And of course what's happened is that the death rate when I was living there of the children, about 50% of the children were dying. Of the 131 children I knew, 65 were alive and 66 weren't. Now, I go down every time I visit the house, I go down to the graveyard and count who's there. And this year there was one dead child from epilepsy, so they say, but usually there's not a single child. The trouble with the Gates Foundation is that they keep people alive. Hooray! They don't give us jobs, and it's jobs we need. Anyway, if any of you are into the Wellcome Institute or other such things, get them to change their tack and give us jobs. Otherwise, worse things could take place. So, but also, of course, treatments have changed. New ones have come in, but often the older ones have gone. So in some ways, my work is a record of the past, which, I mean, they will still remember, but all sorts of problems which cause the mainstream medic, such problems have simply been cast aside. Anyway, well, while to my Hausa hosts, my behavior for a white man was a bit bizarre. Remember, parts of Nigeria like this didn't see a white person for 24 years, and whites were rare and not much wanted. But although my behaviour was bizarre, even in London, my medical anthropology was somewhat controversial. Mary Douglas, bless her heart, and Maurice Bloch, bless his heart, thought it was not a proper subject. For them, the whole experience of sickness was covered by the anthropology of religion. The fact that they didn't know much about sickness was not their problem, it seemed. For them, and particularly for Mary, of course, purity was best investigated theoretically. But Mary Douglas had never once spent a single night in an African household. She always lived in missionary compounds, and actually made women's students do so too. But only Darrell Ford was welcoming, as he usually was. He had worked, unlike most, with W.H.R. Rivers in his younger days, and with Darrell Ford's younger days, and in a sense, strikingly, he had even appointed a young Nigerian to a post in his anthropology department. This was in 1952, when colonialism was at its height. UCL anthropology was quite a distinct place. And it was he who said, welcome, though he hadn't really thought about medical anthropology or sickness. But it was the Biafran War and its effects that dominated my early years in medical anthropology. Particularly, why was it that some war-torn villages in Igbo land recovered very fast and were back prospering? But some did not, and perhaps some of them still haven't. And then, of course, there was the Rwandan genocide. So when we had a very international conference in Windhoek in September 1991 on healing the social wounds of war, many came from all over hoping for answers, but no one had any. The only result of the conference was that the Namibian government set up a special commission for war veterans up in the north. But my three senior Biafran friends said quite simply that their wounds were far from healed. Their scars still itched badly. What did I mean by healing the social wounds of war? Their anger was still quite evident. Alas, most of them are not alive now. But it is on this anger, on its very unhealability, that I want to focus. For I would suggest that much of the terrorism we've seen recently in London, Manchester, Paris, seems to have grown from roots in the fertile soil of anger. Anger at injustices, felt deeply, despite an everyday upbringing within France or Britain. It is anger, not grief, that is felt as losses take place. Pain, I suggest, is expressed in fury. Like when as a child, if I fell off a bicycle, I would furiously kick the bicycle, even though, of course, it made my foot hurt still more. But there is that very evident anger which flares out in hitting what has hurt you, what has annoyed you. So, of course, I'm very interested in how Hausa and their neighbours express and cope with anger. As is quite common, some simply turn their head away from whoever is speaking to them. And it is quite remarkably annoying if someone speaks to you, they turn their head away. It was guaranteed to infuriate British colonials, which of course was part of the fun. But of course, what's more interesting, women, in my experience in particular, take to being totally silent. You don't shout back in anger. Noise is that of a child, not that of an adult. So women would often be completely silent, and it's taken by people who live in this world as a sign of depression. Silent, shiru, is to be depressed. And indeed, if a death takes place, no one screams. Though I have actually heard one woman scream and rush out of the house, and it was taken as weird or bad or something. But it is silence that signals that disaster. So much that if someone dies, the house would fall silent. And if they died in the middle of the night, the silence would actually wake me up. From the normal noises, everything fell silent, even the cocks, and all the rest which moved. So my general point is that conversely, a babbler, surutu, or a screamer is considered just madly manic. So the local therapeutic question is this: how do you get the silent, the depressed, to speak? You can't make bad jokes, or which I have tried, but then that made it worse, I suspect. But by speaking, the theory was that they find relief from their pent-up anger. And so their answer, their therapeutic answer, at least in the world that I've been living in, was to enable the woman to get possessed by one or more spirits, or indeed by the soul of a long-dead relative. And once that persona was taken on, then the ill woman could be coaxed into revealing why was she so angry, why was she so furious. And then she might well speak at length as a protective spirit or a soul spoke through her. It was, I admit, fascinating to watch this private healing process at the work. It wasn't the public performance, the play, that so many visitors to northern Nigeria and elsewhere have recorded as boring. Almost everyone is only allowed to see, of course, the play, the fun boring, the dances, and the this and the that. There's a whole therapeutic side. And indeed, it's nothing like what my old professor, Johan Huis, used to describe as the war between the sexes. I don't honestly think he understood what was taking place. Indeed, so private was this therapy that the men and women doing it would wait till every visitor had left the house, left the farms. I was lucky to be there the whole time as part of the house, so they could do it with me there, or so I like to think. I have to admit, when I left the house to come back to London fairly briefly, it turned out I took all the spirits with me, and they couldn't do any spirit possession until I brought them back again. More problematic was the girl I courted, and of course every young anthropologist falls in love sometime, somehow. The girl couldn't conceive, though she had married the man I helped to convert to Islam. I had inverted her uterus, people said. But when I came back within 2-3 weeks, she was pregnant. And I can assure you, it was nothing to do with me. That child is still alive. But my point is that, in a sense, the kind of therapeutic spirit possession, the body, has now been superseded by a more Islamic version, Ruqya, which initially came in from Yemen, people were saying. Because, of course, the need for effective treatment of silent anger still remains. And I think this is really the important point, because such silent anger is often hard to recognize. No, I'm fine. The rest of you may not be fine. But I'm suggesting that amongst the many displaced people today, there are not only young people fiercely angered by what has happened to them and their families, so angry that perhaps they are willing to express their anger as suicide bombers. You have to be quite cross to strap an explosive belt around this. Under normal circumstances, there is a mentor who will set the bomb off. But more recently, the girls themselves have been blowing themselves up. I'm not sure what the technology change is. But my suggestion is that it's anger that ought to be looked at as part of the component of why suicide bombing is taking place. But I'm suggesting in the camps too, there are older people who help the silently angry. Such helpers may be professional, if scarcely recognized healers, or simply elderly men and women with an understanding of how to cope with a stubbornly silent, deeply angry child or adolescent. And if we can, we ought to recognize the procedures at work and how the old manage to de-anger the children with whom they are. And perhaps even give them help if, but it's a big if, our intrusion won't make matters worse, as it does so often. As most of you will probably know, the vast majority of aid being spent in northeast Nigeria goes on 5-year rents for big houses, mansions, for big SUVs, for big security, and then very little ever goes on the displaced. And indeed, as one Nigerian person said, we've got warehouses full of mattresses waiting to be given out to those in the camps. But we don't do it. They'll be sold. People will forget, and they'll be sold. Aid to displacement is boom time. When Boko Haram was being violent, getting arms was boom, as you probably know. Boko Haram got a lot of their weapons, both from French Chad, but also from the Nigerian army, and of course the generals, with a budget of $6 million a year, kept most of it for themselves. But now it's the big men with big houses in my country that are ruling. But I'm not really talking about that, except that in Bornu and Adamawa, as you all know, there are many hugely overcrowded camps where the displaced try to cope. But I personally speak neither Kanuri nor Fulful, nor any of the many minority languages that victims of Boko Haram's insurgency speak amongst themselves when talking about really serious things. You don't interview displaced people through an interpreter in English. Though there's plenty of people, and I often get sent the papers they write to criticize, but it doesn't do any good, except it gets them their PhD or whatever it is. It's a sad world in that sense. But I think one point that still needs to it, you may wonder where I know about a bit about Boko Haram. Obviously I have certain friends who are actually rather close to Boko Haram. They get the videos and all the other things given to them. But if you're wise in Nigeria, you don't talk about Boko Haram, either to fellow Nigerians, let alone to the press. You're crazy to do it. Not just Boko Haram might wonder why you're there, but similarly the Secret Service may wonder how you know. And so I tend not personally to publish about Boko Haram. People talk to me about things that they know I won't print, but I've known them and they've known me for quite a long time. Perhaps the most annoying thing that I ever said, which I said last year, was that Christians joined Boko Haram. And you can imagine Lambeth Palace in London, where the Archbishop was furious. Christians joining Boko Haram? No, they're Muslim terrorists. But if you can be paid $400 a month for not even going to the front line, it's quite a good job when Bill Gates hasn't provided you with jobs. Anyway, I'm not sure if current pay is $400 a month, but remember, for the Chibok girls, the 100 Chibok girls, the Nigerian government paid up €2 million, which gets you quite a lot of suicide belts or whatever else you might need. But one point that still needs to be made is that people displaced and living in camps may not actually want to return to their own villages or their own homes, but to start afresh. They may well want their land, but to be honest, it's usually quite worn out land. They may want their fields back, but sometimes they don't even want that. Anyway, worse things can happen. At least you can then get a partner. Anyway, but what my point is, I can go back to speaking mode. My point is a simple one, is that tradition, after a disaster, you decide the farmhouse, the farmstead, the city even is polluted, and you need to start all over again. Even huge cities, the ruler like Kano or Katsina or Zagreb, they actually evacuated their cities during the jihad without a fight. It was time to move on. What's past is past, we move again. And on the whole, Northern Europeans or Americans think everyone wants to go back home. But why are you so with the past? On the whole, as you probably know, Nigeria doesn't preserve its past very well, which is partly why I can continue as a historian. There aren't many rivals who will say, rubbish! But they do say that without being historians. But the actual point then is that moving away, you need possibly to find someone who can cleanse the land, or even better, relocate to fresh lands where a new house can be built, new farmland that isn't tired and exhausted. And I think this is where the real challenge is, to get people to realize going back home isn't really on. Even if it's in the mountains or that's where your mosque or your church was. Let's move on. The past is past. Shut up. Get on with the future. I have to admit I get told that quite frequently. But one very final point, because I've overrun my time, is a simple one. It's very interesting how Boko Haram that uses spells, and there's a lot of stories, as you can imagine, about the different spells that Boko Haram uses to spellbind young girls or even their mentors to blow themselves up. It's a very interesting, sometimes it's a special book whose name I got written down, but it means nothing to you, and I can assure you it's not Evans Pritchard's work on the exam. But sometimes it's aerosols, sometimes it's even injections. But everyone says, and this includes people who interrogate people captured, that the spell wears off after 3 days. So perhaps that's why conferences, that explains why conferences are just 3 days long. By the end, the spell has completely worn off. But I do apologize to the organizers of this conference if they thought my keynote address would spellbind you all for at least the 3 days. I have to admit, I never was a spellbinder, as far as my students here will reveal. But I'm sorry if I haven't spellbound you this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, for someone who has his qualms and distances from many others, we could not have chosen a more much out of place setting than this one actually. Mario speaking on the beam. And in fact, last time I heard Mario was a wonderful lecture, which in fact overlaps greatly with things he said today on the notion of the rot in the construct. And I didn't discuss with Christiana or Clara whether this was a lecture with questions and answers, but I think it would be a shame to not to allow Mary to say a few more things, to clarify a few points, or to listen to some of your reactions. So if anyone wants to make a comment or a question, we can get the medical course. Okay, or we can make that.
About Mary Douglas, as students, we knew we could make her blush. And the person who made her blush the deepest got free coffee afterwards. And what she was hopeless on was explaining graphs in economic anthropology. So one would interrupt the lecture midway and score, one hoped, free coffee. That's why I have a tie on to hide how deeply I might blush.
Yes, please. I don't know whether there is a microphone.
I can speak.
Or please speak up. I think Katrina wants a question as well. So I don't know anybody's name, but, or not everybody's name. Some of you are, you know. So please go ahead.
I have a very tiny question, because you mentioned FGM, or did I hear that right? I'm curious what that refers to.
There was a time when, what's the name who did that, the report on female genital mutilation, always used to show northern Nigeria as practicing it. But of course, no one had ever seen it there, and still hasn't taken place. Obviously, there are places in northern Nigeria, particularly Shua women by Lake Chad, who would roughen up their vagina for their male customers. But that's not exactly FGM. The only thing is to identify those women. We took some photographs of them from the 1920s and asked the old men in Bornu who they were. And oh, I remember her, this and that. So, but we learned nothing other than what joy these women did. But that's all. No, it's just, the actual term is chiri, the uvula, and what the Europeans would think was the clitoris. But if you're doing it at 6 weeks, you can't find it. And so these hypertrophic tags are very small and disappear after about 6 weeks. So you can make them and nothing happens. But it has been confused by, dare I say, well-meaning Americans as something terrible. And so NGOs who've gone out and raised money to eliminate FGM in northern Nigeria, not finding it there, have discovered what VVFs, fistula. As you can see, I'm not a great fan of NGOs, but I apologize. One sees it at the receiving end from the women and kids. But fistulae were once viewed because there was an operation where instead of cutting, doing a episiotomy, you cut the front and basically made the urine come out. And so my wife was one of the queens of repairing fistulae. But now others have found it as a nice trade for fame or something. Anyway, sorry. That's more than you wanted to know.
No,
Thank you for this fascinating presentation. And you talked so nicely about anger, and what you described about the anger of young people in northern Nigeria reminds me as very similar anger that I notice in the outskirts of Casablanca and Tunis, for example. Tunisian young people don't join, of course, Boko Haram, but they do join ISIS in massive. So, but I always wondered whether their fathers or their grandfathers were in a way as angry as they are today, or less angry. I mean, is something, could you say something about historical, process of anger in these places.
Let me backtrack a little bit. This is danger ground because I'm a historian at heart, partly because no one can challenge me easily. The answer, in part, is that young men are quite desperate to be rid of their father's authority. And fathers don't get angry. And so there's a real annoyance that dad accepts these things. In the 19th century, the anger of the young could happen in all sorts of ways, of which violence and slave raiding or simply. But northern Nigeria is actually a very peaceful place. When a raider called Haruna wanted to raise an army, he couldn't raise anyone from the slave population. And remember, the slave population outnumbered the free by about 30 to 1. Forget Paul Lovejoy and his 50-50. He doesn't know. But at least some people in the 1820s pointed out that there were 30 slaves for every free person. Why those 30 slaves, or even 2 of them, didn't rise and cut the throats of their owners, God knows, but you didn't. That is to say, there's a whole non-violent tradition. And when the Nasara, the British, came, to be honest, resistance was minimal. Indeed, one politician who was once a slave will sing you the song they sung in his youth. Why, Nasara Christians, have you taken so long to come? There was a real generational glory which the British tapped into. But remember, the British colonial army were only 700 men. The soldiers were all Hausa. Even the British army men spoke Hausa. The commands were in Hausa. So, in some senses, the colonial invasion was a civil war. And by the 1890s, we'd had 3 civil wars. And in a sense, I once wrote a paper, partly as usual to annoy, but it was delivered in Nigeria, on what would have happened had the British and Nasara not come. What were the trends within indigenous northern Nigeria? How would they have developed? And I think one has to realize that things weren't going smoothly. But my general point, which I think is the more important one, the way to have political change in northern Nigeria is to please Allah. Allah determines whether you have change. Though my students think I'm going mad, and they may be right, but it was Allah who brought the Nasara, the Christians. You can't imagine that the Christian God is stronger than ours, Allah. So you've got to realize that the disasters of colonialism were in part Allah's wish, which is why people say, you can't criticize colonialism, it was Allah's wish, at which point they really do say, he's nuts. But my point is the more realistic one. The way you please Allah is to become a better Muslim. And as soon as colonialism came in, northern Nigeria became a much more religious place. We got much more Sufi with the Tijaniya. In particular, we sent more children to Quranic school. We started keeping women in order. It was a very different scene. And eventually Allah did remove the Britons, albeit it took him 60 years, but in Allah's timescale, 60 years. So there's a very real sense to which Boko Haram's success was part of Allah's will. If you do well, He must be approving. And I think this is part of the real problem, that they are doing jihad because that's what would please Allah. Quite why they think children blown up would please Him is beyond me. But it doesn't answer your question, but it gives a sense of the depth. But I do wish anger was taken more seriously in medical anthropology and not just pain and grief, because I think it's much more visible, and particularly with things like depression. Anyway. You must shut me up. I don't go on too long.
I will, don't worry.
He's used to
I'll chat up with Anna.
anger.
I was also very impressed by your showcasing anger as a driver for behavior, which, because it reminds us of work in Afghanistan, where anger is much more a symptom of mental suffering than depression and anxiety. But I was going to ask you, and I think you've already answered that, I was going to ask you, what is the alternative explanation for anger being a driver of recruitment into Boko Haram? Because that doesn't sound true to what I hear, and maybe you have a different kind of information. You mentioned anger as a driver because of social powerlessness, because of not finding a job, and because of wanting some kind of changing social order. But the other explanation would be doing the work of Allah, which is not anger at all. I was going to ask.
Allah can get cross.
Yeah. Right.
So I am told. I mean,
The two can be together, but I was wondering, in the narratives that you hear on the ground, whether it is an emotion that drives you to that, or a social relationship with somebody that does go and get recruited themselves. In other words, is it a psychological emotion that drives you to change the world order, or is it just social relationships and going with your friends? So the two would be very different types of explanation.
I have to admit that I'd be out of a line of work if I believed a word of what foreigners who live in London or wherever, Georgetown, write. They very rarely go there, they very rarely have lived there, and they certainly sometimes don't speak to people who know. I think this whole Boko Haram literature is self-feeding, and although I try to persuade publishers things should get repaired, the publishers want the book out to sell a lot. And so it's a constant fight to try to get a certain local rationality. The other problem is southern Nigerians, as Christians, have a weird view about the north. They actually described recently the President Buhari as a paedophile and a few other such things, and referred to northerners as animals in a zoo. So there is a certain sense that any analysis that comes from the south has got its own prejudices. My argument about recruitment to Boko Haram is that if you lived daily in Nigeria, you too would be furious with the government, with the ways. We are quite cynical in northern Nigeria. When another big merchant builds a mosque beside his mansion, the Hausa term for it is Allah Ganaka. Allah, here's your share of my loot, my booty. They don't think these pious merchants have any piety in them at all. And if, of course, you are a Quranic student begging food, it's often Christian women who are more generous than the Muslim ones, who famously give Muslim beggars food that has been soiled by dust and dirt. It's unedible. There's a very real sense
that the end of the world is coming any day soon. And that's not just Muslims, it's Christians in all sense. So there is an anger built up, I think, as much by sheer what better job to do than join Boko Haram. I mean, it's a very real sense. And if you wonder who supports Boko Haram, there's a huge enabling public that supply the petrol, the water, the supplies. If you have a T-51 tank and drive it around the sands of northern Nigeria, you need a hell of a lot of fuel. Where do they get it from? A lot of it is through contract brought in on motor bikes. And then you might ask, when they loot a place, where does all the loot go? Do terrorists on the back of motorbikes drive off with the emir's 2 windows from his palace? No, of course they sell it to traders. Most of the university cars from Mubi in Adamawa can now be found driving around in Jamaica. That is to say, the market and those enabling the market of Boko Haram is huge. And I think one's got to see that they aren't necessarily the wicked people that I think they are. And in case you think they all have shaven heads, and if you see live pictures, and not videos, but they've all got long hair, just like a traditional warrior would have. They're much closer to the traditional fighting world than pious people. And so, anyway, enough.
I think we're going to ask the last question, perhaps.
So I have a question. The focus on anger is interesting. But what I'm seeing is the focus on anger so far bringing us to a focus on the violence of the other, the non-Christian, the non-European, the non-American, although Bill Gates has brought up, and I approve of your critique of him. Is there a way that a focus on anger can help us elucidate what you allude to in different moments, the political and economic, the structures that might not be as visible, the violence of, in this case, in this framework, the self, the violence of Europe, the violence of capitalism, the violence of America, etc., that otherwise is not being focused on when we talk about anger?
I only really brought anger up because I was much interested in depression, and therefore the anger that underlies the depression. It is part of normal Hausa culture that elders don't roam around, they don't go to market, they sit in their rooms and people come for mediation or whatever else it is. They should not lose their tempers in any sense. Anger, action is the province of the young, and it is their work to be cross, to fight, to do whatever is needed. So in that sense, violence toward the young is normal, but the anger, it seems, derives much more from a real worry about where the future lies. I don't know if you realize, but in the past, farm work was heavy labor. You hoed, you plowed by hand. Now there's almost no heavy labor on the farm. Oxen do the plowing, sprays do the weeding. Even in the household, there's no grinding being done, not even pounding much. That is to say, the labor which employed all the young men has gone. There is almost no labor. So the boys are gone. We can't even raise a football team in the farms instead. So what is interesting is, where do the young men go? And of course they have to go to the big towns, because there's literally no work, even if there were jobs. So in that sense, they are as much perplexed by the lack of jobs even at home. And I think it's important, because I don't see agri development people discussing the eradication of hard labour for either the boys or the wives. It is important that the Salafi Imam in the farms that we have two mosques now, one Salafi, one Sufi. The Salafi Imam won't allow women even to collect grass to feed their goats or sheep. They aren't allowed even to cook foods to sell. So the wives of a Salafi has no income at all. And so they can't attend naming ceremonies or wedding ceremonies or contribute to takaba for widows. So there's a very real sense of depression, and it's not their choice, it's happened. And I think the notion that Boko Haram might change the world, thank God it hasn't, but we don't know. 2 years ago, a person very close to Boko Haram said they were claiming they had enough cash for the next 50 years. That may be an exaggeration, but there's no reason to think that the anger will go away.
Well, on that note, with anger, and I think at some level with hope as well, we can thank Marilas for once again having made us thought very, very deeply and provided us with issues that go beyond medical anthropology, issues that pertain to the ethics of ethnographic fieldwork, to the ethics of policing, to the anger in the world, and to the need to keep on doing this sustained ethnographic research on one single place to claim that we know a little bit how people live and perceive and experience their realities. I find it quite interesting that Marilas 40 years ago was writing about these frontiers that people found in the bushes of the non-Muslim Hausa peripheries, and how today people cannot even go there, and they are finding new frontiers in the cities. And I think that this is a fascinating possibility for research, and I think that it's unique in this case that we can both do the one and the other and historically reconnect. So I thank Murray, but I think that before we actually applaud him and thank him publicly, Christiana would like to have a last word.
We can applaud him.
Okay, thank you.